The America of John McCain is the America of the Revolution. Fighters with no stomach for the summer soldier and the sunshine patriot, making the world anew with the bells of liberty. The America of John McCain is the America of Abraham Lincoln.
That was John McCain's daughter speaking at a service remembering her father after the former presidential candidate died last week. And she wasn't the only one to give McCain a glowing tribute. George Bush, Barack Obama and Bernie Sanders are just some of the political heavyweights who praised the late Republican senator. But others haven't been so complimentary. In fact, many accuse McCain of being a warmongering racist who paved the way for a Trump White House. So how should he be remembered? Well, to discuss this, we're joined in the studio by Matthew Bryza. He's a former U.S. ambassador to Azerbaijan. In Washington, D.C., we have Lawrence Korb. He's a former Assistant Secretary of Defense and served with John McCain in the U.S. Navy. And completing our panel from Pittsfield, Massachusetts, is Owen Higgins. He's a freelance journalist and writer. Matthew Bryza, let me start with you. How should we remember McCain? Give it to me simply.
A fighter, somebody who didn't suffer fools well, who was strongly opinionated, and his opinions focused on fighting for the little guy, the forgotten man and woman, the small countries that he felt were being abused by the larger ones, being disrespected, and he should be remembered as somebody who learned those lessons in the hardest way possible, risking his life, suffering for 5.5 years in prison and under torture.
Owen Higgins, is that the John McCain you remember?
No, I think that is a pretty rosy picture of McCain, but one that does not line up with reality. John McCain was a strong Republican who supported the destruction of the public safety net, tax breaks for billionaires, and never met a war on foreign soil that he did not want the U.S. to become involved with, and did not find the suffering of people in these wars to be really that big of a deal. And I really have to push back, especially on that idea that he was somehow in favor of the little guy when he, in his last year in the Senate, he could have done something about the Saudi Arabian war on Yemen and refused to. And I think that's pretty obviously choosing the stronger in over the week.
Okay, so Larry Korb, opinions differ on John McCain. You served with him in the Navy. Where do you stand?
Well, I think personally, he always put country ahead of himself. Now, one can argue about specific policies, but I think the key thing that always impressed me about him was after he was captured, the Vietnamese, when they recognized that his father was the admiral actually in charge of the war, offered to let him out early. And he refused to do that because the code of conduct for military people and Navy people is, first in, first out. And he knew that they would use that for propaganda purposes. So he said no, knowing that they would actually increase their torture of him. They tortured him, they put him in solitary confinement for 2 years. And then he got out when the war ended. To me, that was putting country above the individual, which many, people do not. And you go along, you take a look at the position. For example, when I was in government and he was in the Congress, he opposed us getting involved in Lebanon, and it turned out he was correct. And his position on wars like, for example, Vietnam, if you're going to do it right. He supported the war in Iraq, which I did not. But what he said, if you're going to do it, make sure you have enough troops to do it, which is different. The Bush administration tried to do it basically on the cheap, and eventually, they had a surge. And he changed his mind on positions over the years. I had a big debate with him when President Clinton tried to open the military to the gays, and he was opposed to it. And I testified, but eventually he did change his mind on it. So he did show that he was malleable, on a lot of these issues. Was he perfect? No. Obviously, if you're a Republican, you may like him more than a Democrat, particularly on many domestic or social issues.
Okay, but many Republicans, especially hardline Trump supporters, don't like him at all. And that's one of the fascinating things about him. That's why a lot of people call him a maverick. Matthew Bryza, is it possible to say, okay, He's 5 years as a prisoner of war in Vietnam. They tortured him. They did terrible things to him. That deserves a lot of respect. That's commendable. But beyond that, we can still also say the man was a hawk. He supported the Iraq War. He was keen on preemptive strikes, what's called humanitarian intervention. That doesn't mean that he wasn't somebody who deserved respect for what happened in Vietnam and so forth, but he was probably as hawkish as they come in foreign policy.
Oh, he was very hawkish, and that gets back to what I was referring to when I talked about the little guy. I wasn't necessarily referring to domestic politics, though, by the way, he did cast the deciding vote against President Trump's attempt to repeal the Affordable Care Act, which was a pretty powerful step that should have helped people, more common people. But I was referring to his engagement, his fight for smaller countries, for countries where democracy was under threat by coups, whether it's in Fiji or where a minority is being persecuted like the Rohingya in Myanmar.
And fair enough, but then the 2017 congressional bill, what Owen was talking about, the Stop Arming Terrorists Act, that was essentially drafted in order to stop the U.S. supplying the Saudis with arms in bombing Yemen.
Right. You're right. He's no saint, right? And
Saudis are not the little guy, are they?
Saudis are not the little guy, and we know in this case that the bomb that was dropped on the horrible bombing of the school bus was an American-made bomb. Yeah, but no, Saudis are not the little guy. But he also there were many facets to his view on national security, and this is about a proxy war really between Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Owen Higgins, he was seen as a reasonable Republican by many on the left and seen as a maverick Republican by many on the right. Many couldn't make their minds up about him. Do you think that ultimately here was a man who was complicated and there was some good and there was some bad? Perhaps you just see a bit more bad than the good?
Well, I think everybody has a nuanced facets to their personality. As far as John McCain as a person, I can't actually speak to that. But what I can say is that as a public figure, I think that we should remember him as he was, especially with his funeral being such a political event. And I really can't look at his record in Congress and see anything that really reflects what your other guests are saying. He was a pretty staunch Republican. The idea that he was a maverick really seems like it's kind of a media-created version of events that doesn't really line up with reality. I'll give you an example. Yes, he did cast the deciding vote against the ACA after, it should be said, making sure that all the reporters were watching. But then a few weeks later, he voted for the Bush tax cuts, or the Trump tax cuts, which essentially destroyed the ACA by getting rid of the mandate. So although he did cast that one dramatic vote against destroying the ACA in whole, he when it came to policy for the tax cut, he did basically the same thing, and it didn't get the same amount of attention, which I think it really should have.
So Larry Korb, setting aside everything he did as a senator, let's look at him for a moment as presidential candidate when he was running against Barack Obama. A lot of people feel, well, he lost, so ultimately it was the wrong decision to choose Sarah Palin as his running mate. But to take that a step further, there are those who say, when he chose Sarah Palin as his running mate, he actually then triggered something or started something that metastasized into the Trump phenomenon. Is that fair?
Well, I think there's no doubt about it that was a big mistake, and I think he recognized that. As he said in his books, he wanted to choose Joe Lieberman, the former senator from Connecticut, but was talked into selecting Sarah Palin because of the fact he needed to galvanize his campaign. I don't think anybody realized when she was selected, her deep, positions on a lot of these issues. And that's why, several people have said to me, well, why wasn't she invited to the funeral? I think that's one of the reasons. But again, if you go back and you take a look, for example, he worked with Teddy Kennedy on immigration reform. He worked with Russ Feingold, a very liberal from Wisconsin, on campaign finance reform. So he did work across the aisle on a lot of issues, more than a lot of people, unfortunately, now are doing. But I think you're right. Inadvertently, I think by picking Sarah Palin, he laid the groundwork for what we've seen with President Trump.
Matthew Bryza, Sarah Palin, the Tea Party, the years tumble along, something new creates a new political reality, a new political tone. Did McCain play a part in that by choosing Sarah Palin?
He certainly played a part in it, but yeah, and she was a choice that at the time many people complained had not really been vetted. That's what Mr. Korb is essentially saying right now as well. But the Tea Party, Trumpism, these are political forces that are much bigger than John McCain or Donald Trump. I think that the passing of John McCain is the passing of a different political era in the United States. When, yes, there was the Tea Party, there was this growing populism in American politics, but he was not part of the populist wave. He was part of an era of more bipartisanship, civility. Yes, even though he was a staunch Republican, you look at who attended his funeral, and it was a bipartisan showing, including the two presidents who beat him in presidential elections.
Right. Owen Higgins, Matthew Bryza used the word civility. Would you concede that McCain perhaps represented a more civil time?
Well, I'm not sure if that's accurate. McCain used a lot of language that I don't think that I can use here, referring to his wife by using a pretty horrible slur. He referred to Asians in general using a racial slur in 2000.
Although he said he was only
as long as he lived.
He said he was only talking about his captors then when he was asked to explain that, right? I mean, just adding a qualification to that, yes.
But does that excuse it?
No, absolutely not.
But
just adding it to it, yeah.
And as far as McCain, representing this kind of civility, I mean, does it really change things if we're just talking about the same policies in a polite way? I don't know if I agree with that. I don't think that is a healthy or productive way to look at public policy when it's being developed in the most powerful country in the world, whether or not it's directed at a domestic or a foreign audience. Whether you're polite or not, what you're doing is going to have major effects on people's lives. And I think somebody like McCain, who voted against sanctions on apartheid South Africa 6 times, who voted against the creation of the Martin Luther King Day, who voted against the Civil Rights Bill of 1990, who supported the Papers, Please Act in Arizona in 2010. I think the fact that he was more polite than Trump when he was pursuing these policies, I don't know if that really matters in the end.
Okay, very finally, Larry Korb. Does he look better posthumously just because Trump is so unpalatable and just so rude?
Well, I think he looks better because he was one of the first Republicans to stand up to Trump. Remember, he pulled his endorsement of Trump before the election. And since he's, in his last year of his life, he stood up to Trump. Well, a lot of people in the party won't. In fact, I think one of the worst things about that ceremony was all the people who came there and listened to what his daughter and other people said about Trump, and they still support him. And so I think, he really did do that. He stood up to him, and he has admitted his mistakes. As our colleague up in Massachusetts talking about, yes, he did a lot of these things, like, for example, voting against the Dr. King holiday, but then he said he was wrong. And I think that's what we don't have enough. People are going to make mistakes, but are they going to come back and say, I did make a mistake. I was wrong. And let me tell you, I've changed my mind. And that's what I think people admire so much about him, that he eventually did say, yeah, I did the wrong thing, but I did the right thing. And remember in the 2008 campaign, when everybody was saying Obama wasn't a citizen, he was the one who said, no, he's a great American. I mean, that hurt him in the election. And in the 2000 campaign, when Bush claimed that the daughter they adopted from Bangladesh was an illegitimate child, he still was able to get over that. So I think in the final analysis, he's much more right than the wrongs that he did.
Okay, contested legacy. It's been really fascinating getting the different perspectives from all of you. We're out of time, but I thank you all for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Matthew Bryza, Larry Korb, and Owen Higgins. Thanks again.